The long shed stood at the edge of the field, its wooden walls weathered to silver, and from within came a sound like rain that never arrived. A woman in a patched apron stood at the entrance, a lantern casting her shadow across the threshold. She had not slept well in weeks. The town called her the widow's folly, but she had a name, Elara Cross. She was 24 years old, unmarried, and the only thing she owned was a 2-room house and a reputation for keeping to herself. Her parents had died of fever when she was 19, leaving her a house, a garden gone to weeds, and a quiet that had settled into her bones. She took in mending to survive. Every morning she carried a basket of torn shirts and split seams, and every evening she returned them pressed and perfect, her stitches so small they vanished into the cloth. People praised the work and forgot the woman. That was the arrangement. Welcome to Frontier Secrets. I am your narrator, Elias Vance. Here we unearth the forgotten stories of the American frontier, the women and men who built lives from nothing, who faced mockery and hardship, and turned them into quiet triumph. This is the story of Elara Cross and the strange inheritance that changed everything. The worms belonged to Hester Parrish, a widow who had come to Meadow Creek from somewhere east, bringing a box of eggs no bigger than a thimble. The town had laughed at her for years. She planted rows of glossy bushes instead of corn, and she kept a long shed that no one was allowed inside. When children asked what she grew there, she said, "Patience," and laughed at their confusion. The men who gathered outside the feed store had opinions about everything, and Hester was a favorite subject. Chester Wainwright, the banker who held the paper on half the farms along the river, called her shed a monument to wasted ground. Lands for cattle and grain, he liked to say, thumbs in his vest. Anything else is a woman playing at farming. People laughed because Chester held their notes, and you laughed at the jokes of men who held your notes. Elara had heard it all. She had learned to walk past with her basket and her eyes forward. She had decided somewhere in those quiet years that the town's approval was a coin she would never earn, and she had stopped trying to spend it. Then Hester's cough deepened into something that rattled, and the doctor came less and shrugged more. And one gray November afternoon, the old woman pressed a folded paper into Elara's hand and told her the shed and everything in it now belonged to her. 3 days later, Hester was gone. The reading of the will took 4 minutes in the lawyer's cramped office. Hester had no children, no living kin anyone could find. To Elara Cross, she left the house, the land, and the entire contents of the rearing shed, together with all instructions left therein. The lawyer cleared his throat. There's also this. He handed Elara a thick leather notebook, its pages swollen with Hester's slanting hand, pressed leaves, and careful diagrams. On the cover, the old woman had written one line, "For the patient one." Outside, Chester Wainwright was waiting on the boardwalk, hat in hand, all false sympathy. He offered to buy the parish land that very afternoon. Cash, a fair price, he said, to spare Elara the trouble of a property she couldn't possibly work. "River-bottom acreage like that should feed cattle," he explained, "not sit idle growing a dead woman's foolishness." Elara said she would think on it. That night she walked to the parish place alone and stood before the long shed with the key cold in her palm. For 2 years Hester had never once let her inside. Whatever waited there had been the old woman's last and largest secret. She turned the key. The smell met her first, green and faintly sweet, like cut grass and something living. She raised her lamp. The shed ran 40 feet long, and along both walls, stacked wooden frames from floor to shoulder height held trays. She counted as she walked. 200 of them. Each held a bed of chopped leaves, and across each bed crept hundreds of pale, plump worms, no longer than her thumb, rising and falling in a slow tide as they fed. The sound filled the whole building, a soft, continuous rustle like rain that never arrived. Elara's first feeling was revulsion. Her second, beneath it, was wonder. She opened Hester's notebook by lamplight, sat on an overturned crate, and read until the candle guttered. The worms were Bombyx mori, silkworms, brought as eggs across an ocean and 2 railroads. They ate only the leaves of the white mulberry, Hester's strange glossy bushes, and they ate constantly, doubling and doubling, until the day each one wrapped itself in a single unbroken thread, half a mile long, and turned that thread into a cocoon. From those cocoons came silk, real silk, the notebook insisted, the same cloth that draped queens, grown here in Missouri river mud by a stubborn old woman who refused to believe it couldn't be done. But the worms were nearly grown. The notebook was emphatic in its underlining. At this stage, they ate their own weight many times over each day. And if they were not fed, they would not spin. They would simply die, 200 trays of them, within the week. Elara sat very still in the rustling dark and understood the shape of the choice. Take Chester's money, walk away, let the worms starve, and remain forever the quiet mending woman the town tolerated. Or stay, learn an impossible craft from a dead woman's notebook, alone, with no one to ask and everyone to mock. She had no idea how to reel a thread, weave a cloth, sell a yard of it. She knew only mending. She knew only how to make small, invisible stitches that nobody noticed. Folks judge a thing by how it looks the first day. The worms rustled. The lamp burned low. Somewhere across the bottoms, a dog barked and went quiet. And the whole sleeping town dreamed its small, certain dreams about who Elara Cross was and would always be. If these forgotten stories of the frontier speak to your heart, subscribe to Frontier Secrets and stay by the fire a little longer. She looked at the feeding worms once more and made her choice. It came not as a thunderclap, but as a quiet settling, the way a thread finds its place in the weave. She would not sell. She would not let the worms starve. She would learn to reel silk from Hester's notebook, fumble through the failures, and face the town's laughter with her head up. Patience had never meant waiting quietly to be ruined. Hester had not been quiet. Hester had planted glossy trees in a corn town and dared it to laugh. By dawn, Elara was outside in the gray light, stripping mulberry leaves into her apron, fingers stiff with cold, because the notebook said the morning feeding could not wait, and she would not let the first thing Hester ever entrusted to her die on her watch. She fed them. She walked the length of the shed, scattering leaves across 200 trays. And the rustling swelled into something almost grateful, and she felt absurdly that she was needed. When Chester's hired man rode out mid-morning for her answer, Elara met him at the gate with mulberry stains on her hands and said the land was not for sale. The man laughed all the way back to town, but Elara did not hear him. She was already inside the shed, learning the rhythm of a new and impossible life. The rhythm of that life came slowly, in increments so small she barely noticed them at first. The first week was a blur of green-stained hands and sleepless nights. Elara rose before the sun, lit the lamp, and walked the length of the shed with her apron full of mulberry leaves, scattering them across 200 trays. The worms lifted their heads as the leaves fell, 100,000 tiny mouths finding the fresh green, and the rustling deepened into something like a sigh. She learned to read the trays the way Hester's notebook instructed, to know by the color of the frass, by the way the worms moved, by the angle of their heads, whether they were hungry or sick or ready to climb. She learned that some worms were stronger than others, that a weak worm left in a crowded tray could spoil its neighbors, and that culling was a kindness she had to steel herself to perform. The notebook was plain about it. "We take a life to make a thing of use and beauty," Hester had written, "the way we do with the lamb and the flax. Do it kindly and waste nothing. That is the whole of the bargain." Elara did it kindly. She wasted nothing, but she wept the first time she had to lift a sluggish worm from the tray and carry it outside to the garden, where the birds would find it before the day was done. The mockery arrived on the second morning. A boy from town rode past on a mule and saw Elara hauling water to the shed. He stopped, stared, and then hollered back toward the road, "She's feeding the worms!" By noon, the word had spread through the feed store and the general store and the church steps. The worm woman, they called her. Poor Hester's madness passed on to the only fool soft enough to take it. Children dared each other to run up and peek through the cracks in her shed. A pair of young men left a dead rat on her porch with a note tied to its tail. "For your herd." Elara found it, buried it in the garden without a word, and went back to the trays. She had learned long ago not to argue with the town. Arguing only gave them more to chew. But she could not keep her work hidden. The mulberry trees stood along the property line, visible from the road, and anyone who passed could see the branches growing thinner as the days wore on. Elara stripped leaves 4 times a day, and still the worms ate faster. The notebook had warned her. At their final stage, they eat their own weight every few hours. You will not believe how much they consume until you have fed them. Then you will believe, and you will despair. She did despair briefly on the 4th day, when she ran out of fresh leaves before the evening feeding and had to go back out with a lantern, cutting branches in the dark, praying the worms would hold. They held. They always held. They were patient in their hunger, plump and pale and single-minded, and they taught her that desperation could be met with steady hands. The dressmaker's name was Martha Fielding. She had come to Meadow Creek from St. Louis 2 years before with a sewing machine and a hard, practical kindness. The town used her and gossiped about her in equal measure. She was a widow, though she never spoke of her husband, and she kept her own hours and her own opinions. She was the only soul who came out to the Vance place that first week, not to mock, but because she had heard about the worms and was, she admitted, simply too curious to stay away. She stood in the shed doorway, took in the rustling trays, and instead of laughing, she said quietly, "Show me." Elara, who had not been asked to show anyone anything in years, opened the notebook. The 2 women bent over the pages by lamplight while the worms fed and slept and fed again. Martha listened without interruption, then said, "You have thread here. You have a reel. Do you have a loom?" Elara shook her head. "I have no notion how to make cloth from thread, only how to mend it." Martha smiled, the first real smile Elara had seen in days. "I have a loom in my back room that came with a debt. I have never once used it. We'll teach ourselves." It was the plainest kind of kindness, offered without ceremony, and Elara accepted it with a nod that tried very hard not to be a sob. The days grew longer, and the worms grew fatter, and the town grew louder. Chester Wainwright did not like being laughed at, and he had been quietly but unmistakably upstaged. When the worm woman's cloth, not yet made, only anticipated, started passing hand to hand as a rumor, and the same people who had snickered with him began saying, "Well, perhaps there's something to it," Chester felt the arrangement slipping. He understood money, and he had begun to understand that there might be real money in Elara Cross's shed. Money he had offered to buy out for a pittance and been refused by a woman in front of his own hired man. He started with the mulberry trees. They stood along the property line where the Vance land met a strip of bottom ground Chester had bought years before and left in pasture. Elara received a letter, lawyer stiff, informing her that a survey had determined the mulberry row encroached upon Mr. Wainwright's property by several feet, and that the trees must be removed within 30 days, or Mr. Wainwright would have them removed at her expense. Elara read it twice and felt the old cold settle in her stomach. Without the mulberry, there were no leaves. Without leaves, no worms. Without worms, nothing. The whole delicate enterprise hung on those 40 trees, and a man with money and a lawyer had found exactly where to cut. She rode into town and pulled the old county plat at the courthouse herself, spreading it on the clerk's high counter, tracing the property line with her green-stained finger. The trees stood well within the Vance boundary. The survey was a fiction Chester had paid for, but fighting a fiction took a lawyer, and a lawyer took money. And though she had hope, she had no war chest. Chester knew that too. He was not trying to win in court. He was trying to bleed her until she quit. The night the cocoons began to form, Elara forgot every trouble for a few hours. The notebook had told her to watch for the sign. A worm that stopped eating, voided itself, and reared up restless, casting its head back and forth as if searching. Hester had built mounting frames for exactly this, little cardboard lattices of cubbies, and Elara set them into the trays just as the diagram showed. The worms climbed in, one to a cubby, and began to swing their heads in slow figure-eights, paying out an invisible thread so fine she could only see it when the lamplight caught it just so. Over 2 days, before her eyes, each worm wrapped itself into a cocoon the size of a robin's egg, gold and white and faintly luminous, until the frames were full of them like rows of tiny lanterns. Elara stood in the shed at midnight, surrounded by thousands of them, and understood finally what Hester had meant about what a thing becomes. The ugly, rustling worms were gone. In their place hung something that looked like treasure. The reeling was harder. The notebook described a contraption, a basin of warm water, a brush, a reel turned by a hand crank. Elara had found it under canvas in the corner of the shed, built by Hester's own hands. She dropped a handful of cocoons in the warm water and brushed at them the way the diagram showed, and after a frustrating hour, found the trick of it. The warmth loosened the gum binding the thread, and with the brush she could catch the loose ends, gather 5 or 6 together, because one alone was too fine to use, and wind them onto the reel as a single combined strand. Her first attempts were a disaster of snarls and snapped threads and water everywhere. Her second day's work she threw out entirely, but on the third day she found a rhythm. Feed the broken filaments in as each cocoon unwound to its end. Keep the tension even. Let the reel turn slow and steady, and a skein of pale, glistening thread began to grow. Thread she had grown and gathered and made with her own 2 stained and aching hands. She wove her first piece on Martha's loom in the back room of the dress shop, with the curtains drawn, because neither woman wanted an audience for the fumbling. The notebook helped here too. Hester had pages on warping and weaving written plainly, as if she had taught it before. They strung the warp wrong the first time and had to cut it all away. They strung it wrong the second time in a different way. The third time it held, and Elara sat at the loom and began to weave, throwing the shuttle of her own silk thread back and forth, beating each pass tight, watching cloth appear 1/8 of an inch at a time. It was the slowest thing she had ever done, slower even than her invisible mending, and she loved it with a fierceness that surprised her. Hour by hour, evening by evening, a length of fabric grew on the loom, and as it grew, it began to shimmer. The silk caught the lamplight and gave it back changed, soft and shifting, a pale honey color that was the worm's own and that no dye had touched. Elara would run her finger along it and feel the smoothness, cool and warm at once, stronger than it had any right to be for something so fine. When the first full length came off the loom, a piece perhaps 3 feet by 6, with edges that wandered and a few flaws where her tension had slipped, the 2 women laid it out across Martha's cutting table and simply looked at it. Outside, the ordinary town went about its certain business. On the table lay something the town had no idea existed within 500 miles of it. "Lord," Martha said softly. "Elara, do you know what this is?" "It has mistakes," Elara said, because she could only see the flaws. "It's silk, real silk, grown here." Martha pressed her palm flat against it. "I sold dresses in St. Louis. I have touched bolts that came off ships. This is that. This is that. And you made it out of a dead woman's shed and your own stubbornness." Elara felt something she had not felt in 5 years, a small, fierce pride that had nowhere to go. They decided sensibly to start with something honest. Martha cut the flawed length into squares and hemmed them as fine handkerchiefs, and Elara embroidered a corner of each with a tiny mulberry leaf in green thread. Her invisible stitches finally visible, finally signed. A dozen handkerchiefs of pale honey silk, smooth as water, light as breath. Martha took them to her shop and set them in a basket by the window with a card that said, "Pure silk, locally made." She did not say by whom. She wanted, she told Elara, to see what the cloth did before the gossip got to it. She wanted the town to judge the thing before it judged the woman. It was, Elara would later understand, the smartest thing anyone did in the whole affair. The handkerchiefs sold in 2 days. The doctor's wife bought 3. The banker's daughter bought 2 and asked, breathless, whether more was coming. A traveling drummer passing through bought the last 4 on sight and asked Martha where on God's earth she had gotten genuine silk in a river town, and offered to buy any quantity she could supply for the St. Louis trade. Martha came flying out to the Vance place at dusk with the empty basket and a fistful of money and her eyes alight. "They didn't laugh," she said, half laughing herself. "Elara, they didn't laugh. They fought over them. The drummer wants everything you can make. Everything." For one bright, suspended moment, standing in the rustling shed, Elara let herself believe it had turned. That was when the trouble truly began. The trouble wore a vest and held the paper on half the farms along the river. Chester Wainwright did not like to be laughed at, and he had been quietly but unmistakably bested. When the worm woman's cloth started passing hand to hand, and the same people who had snickered with him began saying, "Well, perhaps there is something to it," a man like Chester measured his standing in town by how many others arranged their opinions to match his, and he could feel that arrangement slipping. Worse, he understood money, and he had begun to understand that there might be real money in Elara Cross's shed. Money he had offered to buy out for a pittance and been refused by a woman in front of his own hired man. He worked the only lever he truly owned. He went to the men whose notes he held, small farmers, the blacksmith, the man who hauled freight to the railhead, and he mentioned in his easy, thumbs-in-vest way that he would hate to see anyone extend credit or labor or cartage to a venture as unproven as the worm farm. He did not threaten. He never threatened. He simply reminded people warmly who held their paper and let them arrive at caution on their own. It worked the way it always worked. The man who had agreed to haul Elara's cloth to the railhead sent word he was too busy. The boy she had hired to help strip leaves stopped coming, his father's face tight and apologetic at the gate. Doors that had cracked open after the handkerchiefs eased shut again. The town, which had been on the very edge of admiring her, remembered that admiration was expensive, and Chester Wainwright was not. Elara stood in her shed one gray morning and felt the walls draw in. The worms rustled, hungry as ever, indifferent to lawyers and loans. They needed feeding 4 times a day, whether or not the town allowed her to succeed. She had thread on the reel, and an order she could not fill alone, and a man with money methodically closing every road out. She had been so close. She had felt it turn, and now she watched it turning back. The old voice in her said what it had always said: "You were never meant to have it. Take what you are offered and be quiet." But Martha did not believe in being quiet, and that, in the end, made all the difference. But first, they had to weather the worst of it together. The dressmaker came out that evening after the hauler's refusal arrived, and found Elara sitting on a crate in the shed with Hester's notebook closed in her lap and the lamp unlit. Martha lit it without a word, then sat down on a second crate and said, "Tell me all of it." Elara told her, the fictional survey, the 30-day notice, the quiet word Chester had spread, the hauler, the boy, the doors easing shut. Saying it aloud made it sound even more hopeless than it had felt. A single woman against a man who owned the town's debts, fighting over worms. Martha was quiet a long moment. Then she said the thing Elara had not let herself think. "He is not doing this because he thinks you will fail. He is doing this because he is afraid you will succeed. You do not bury a thing that is already dead, Elara. You bury a thing that is growing." It was true, and it helped. But truth did not haul cloth to the railhead or feed 200 trays of worms with 3 hands instead of 6. The next days were the hardest of the whole venture. Elara fed and reeled and wove and slept in snatches, and Martha closed her shop 2 afternoons to help strip leaves, and still it was not enough. A row of trays began to fail because Elara could not get to them in time, and she had to cull more worms than she ever had. Each one she culled was thread she would not have, and money she would not make, and a small kindness. Do it kindly, waste nothing, that grew harder to hold to when she was this tired and this afraid. Then the 30-day notice ran to 10 days, and Chester, sensing the moment, raised the pressure one last turn. He let it be known he would renew his offer to buy the Vance land, but lower now, half what he had offered before, given the legal cloud over the property line and the woman's evident inability to work it. He framed it as mercy. He always framed it as mercy. He let the offer sit out there in the town's gossip like a lifeline thrown to someone he himself had pushed in the water. And the worst of it was that Elara was tempted. She stood at the reel one night with her hands cracked and her back screaming and the lamp burning the last of her oil, and she thought about how simple it would be. Take the money, even the lower money, pay nothing more to a lawyer. Walk back into town as the woman who had tried something foolish and come to her senses. Let them be kind to her again, the way people are kind to those who have stopped reaching. The worms would die, but the worms would not know they died. Only she would know. She did not take the money that night, but she did not refuse it either. and the not refusing sat in her chest like a stone. What turned her, what truly turned her, was small, the way the deciding things always were. Martha, leaving late that evening, paused in the shed door and looked back at the trays glowing faintly in the lamplight. "You know what I keep thinking?" she said. "Hester carried these worms across an ocean and 2 railroads, as a box of eggs no bigger than a thimble. She had no help and no welcome, and everybody telling her she was a fool. And she didn't quit because she wasn't doing it for them. She was doing it for whoever came after, for the patient one." Martha tied her shawl. "She picked you, Elara, out of a whole town. She watched everybody for years, and she picked you. Now Chester Wainwright wants to be the one who decides that was a mistake. I don't think it is his to decide." Then she went home, and Elara sat alone with the worms, and the closed notebook, and the stone in her chest. And somewhere in the long hours before dawn, she understood that she had been about to let a frightened, prideful man tell her one final time what she was allowed to become. She fell asleep on the crate, her head on the notebook, and dreamed of the mulberry trees bending in the wind, their roots deep in the river-bottom soil, refusing to be moved. She woke to the first gray light seeping through the shed boards, her neck stiff and the notebook pressed against her cheek. The worms rustled in the dimness, hungry and patient, indifferent to the weight she carried. She rose, lit the lamp, and began the morning feeding with hands that still remembered the shape of despair from the night before. But something had shifted in her chest during those hours of broken sleep. The stone was still there, but it no longer sat at the bottom of her lungs, pressing the breath out. It had moved to a place where she could carry it and work around it. She fed the trays in order, smallest to largest, just as the notebook instructed, and when she reached the end of the shed, she found that she had not once paused to wonder whether she would quit. That, she decided, was enough for one morning. The 30-day notice had 12 days left. Chester's lowered offer sat in the lawyer's office, waiting for her signature. She had not gone to sign it, but she had not formally refused it either, and the not refusing still whispered its temptations in the quiet hours. But the feeding came first, always the feeding, and then the reeling, and then the long afternoons at Martha's loom, where the silk grew inch by inch under her fingers. The drummer's order for the St. Louis trade waited on a scrap of paper pinned above the reel. She had promised him 20 yards of finished cloth by the first frost. She had not yet managed 5. The gap between what she had promised and what she could deliver stretched wider every day. And every day, Chester's people found new ways to remind her of it. The rumors began appearing in the weekly paper. Not by name, Chester was too careful for that, but in the form of an editorial written by a man who never signed his pieces, a man everyone knew took his opinions from the banker's table. "A note of caution to our citizens," the editorial read, "regarding ventures that promise much and deliver little. The novelty of a product does not guarantee its worth, and those who invest their hopes in unproven schemes may find themselves disappointed when the cold realities of winter set in. Land that could support honest agriculture should not be given over to fads that enrich no one but the speculator." Elara read it in the general store, standing by the stove, while the men who had been laughing at her a month before now glanced at her sideways and said nothing. The word speculator stung worse than any name they had called her before, because it cast her as a cheat, someone who had never intended to produce anything real, someone playing a game with other people's hopes. She folded the paper and put it in her apron pocket, because she could not afford to buy it and would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her leave empty-handed. Martha read the editorial that evening and said exactly what Elara had been thinking. He is cornering you. The survey, the lowered offer, the whispering to every man who owes him money, and now this. He is building a cage of public opinion so that even if you succeed, the town will believe you succeeded through trickery rather than work. The only way out is to show them the work. Not tell them, show them. Elara nodded, but the weight of showing felt insurmountable. She had one loom, 2 hands, and a shed full of worms that needed feeding 4 times a day. The cloth she had made so far was good, she knew that now, but it was not enough to silence a town that had already decided she was a fool. She needed something larger, something that could not be ignored or dismissed as a passing novelty. The idea did not come from her or from Martha. It came from Abigail Fairchild, the widow who had sewn for the congregation for 30 years, and whose word carried weight in the church women's circle that no banker's opinion could touch. Abigail appeared at the Vance place on a Tuesday afternoon, unannounced, with a basket of bread and a look of sharp appraisal that took in the shed, the mulberry trees, and Elara's green-stained hands in a single sweep. She had heard about the silk, she said. She had seen the handkerchiefs at Martha's shop, had touched one and held it to the light, and she had a question. The congregation had been saving for 2 years to replace the altar cloth, the old one having worn through in the center where the minister's hands rested every Sunday. They had hoped for fine linen, perhaps a bolt from St. Louis, but they had never dreamed of silk. Abigail looked at Elara with the plain, unflinching gaze of a woman who had buried 2 husbands and learned exactly how the world worked. Could you weave a length long enough for the altar, wide enough to drape, with a border that would do justice to the Lord's table? The church would pay what we can, which is not much. But the payment would not be the point, and you know it as well as I do. The point would be that it would hang in front of the whole town every Sunday morning, and every person who walked past it would have to reckon with what your hands made. Elara felt the proposition land like a stone in still water. The cloth would take everything she had. Weeks of weaving, the best silk she could produce, a length of perhaps 6 feet by 4, with a border that would require her finest stitching. It would mean setting aside the drummer's order, delaying the income she needed to survive, and pouring every ounce of her energy into a single piece that would be given away rather than sold. But Abigail was right about the point. A piece of cloth hanging in the church, visible to every soul in Meadow Creek, could not be whispered away. It could not be dismissed by an editorial or a lowered offer. It would be a fact, plain and undeniable, that the woman they had called the worm farmer had made something beautiful enough to stand before the congregation. Elara said yes before she had fully thought through the cost. The yes came from the same quiet certainty that had made her keep the worms alive that first night, the same stubborn refusal to let the town decide what she was allowed to become. She said yes, and Abigail's face softened into something that might have been pride, and then the widow was gone, leaving a basket of bread and a commission that would either save Elara or break her entirely. The next morning, Elara walked down to the mulberry grove to assess the trees. The 30-day notice still loomed, but she had decided not to fight the survey in court. She could not afford a lawyer, and Chester knew it. Instead, she would harvest what leaves she could, push the trees as far as they would go, and trust that the cloth would be finished before the deadline did its worst. She walked the row counting branches, noting which trees were leafing strongest, planning her cuttings for the weeks ahead. And then she stopped cold. 3 trees near the end of the row, the ones closest to the road, stood blackened and dead. The bark was charred in a band around the trunks, the leaves curled and brown, and the ground beneath them was littered with ash, and the remains of a small fire that had been set against the bark and left to burn. Someone had been there in the night. The fire had not spread, the dew had stopped it, or a coward's nerve had failed. But 3 trees were ruined beyond recovery, and the message was plainer than any lawyer's letter. Elara stood among the blackened trunks and felt the old cold settle into her bones. This was not a survey. This was not an editorial. This was a threat written in ash, delivered in the dark, with no name attached and no proof to carry to a sheriff who owed his position to Chester's goodwill. She could not prove who had done it. She could not even prove it was connected to the banker. But she knew, and the trees knew, and the worms in the shed would know soon enough when the leaves began to run short. 3 trees meant fewer feedings, smaller trays, fewer cocoons, less silk. The altar cloth would require every thread she could produce, and now she had lost a portion of her harvest before the first branch had been cut. She did not weep this time. The tears that had come when she knelt in the wet grass after the survey had been a release, a recognition of her own exhaustion. This was different. This was anger, clean and cold and focused, rising from a place she had not known she possessed. She walked back to the shed, opened Hester's notebook to the page on force ripening, and began calculating whether she could coax the remaining trees into producing an extra flush of leaves before the first frost. The notebook was not optimistic, but it offered a method: heavy watering, careful pruning, a mixture of wood ash and manure spread around the roots. It would be labor, more labor than she had hours for, but it might buy her enough to finish the cloth. She read the page twice, then went to the pump and began hauling water to the grove, bucket by bucket, through the long afternoon, while the town went about its business and the blackened trees stood sentinel at the edge of her small kingdom. Martha arrived at dusk with a jar of soup and word that the church women's circle had voted unanimously to commission the altar cloth. She took one look at Elara's face, and then at the charred trunks visible through the gap in the row, and she said nothing at all for a long moment. Then she set down the soup, picked up the second bucket, and began hauling water beside Elara in silence. They worked until the light failed, and when they stopped, Martha said only, "We will need more hands." Elara shook her head. "No one will come. Chester has made sure of that." Martha looked at her with the flat, practical gaze that had carried her through her own widowhood. "Then we will do it ourselves, and we will do it slower, and we will finish anyway." The weeks that followed were the hardest labor Elara had ever known. She rose before dawn, fed the worms by lamplight, hauled water to the mulberry grove, cut the day's leaves, returned to the shed for the midday feeding, spent the afternoon at the reel, then walked to Martha's shop for the evening weaving session. She ate standing up when she remembered to eat at all. She slept in the shed on the crate, wrapped in a blanket, with the worms rustling around her like a living tide. The silk grew slowly on the loom, a pale honey expanse that caught the lamplight and seemed to glow from within. Martha wove beside her when she could, but the dress shop still demanded its hours, and Elara wove alone through the long evenings, the shuttle beating a rhythm that became her only prayer. The 30-day notice ran to 5 days, and then to 3, and then to 1. Elara had not responded to the survey or to the offer, and she expected Chester's hired man to appear at any moment with a crew and an axe, ready to cut down every mulberry tree on Vance land. But the day came and went without incident. She learned later that Abigail Fairchild had visited the courthouse and filed a formal complaint on behalf of the church women's circle, citing vandalism and suspected intimidation of a woman engaged in honest commerce. The clerk had been forced to take it, and the complaint had made its way to the sheriff, who had been forced to make a show of investigating, which meant riding out to the Vance place and looking at the blackened trees and taking notes in a small book that would never yield a suspect. But the investigation had the effect of making Chester's next move riskier. An open attack on the trees now would be noticed, and noticed things could not be blamed on drifters or accidents. The trees survived. The silence held. The altar cloth grew. Elara wove the main body in a plain weave, tight and even, the thread so fine that the fabric seemed to float when she lifted it from the loom. The border she reserved for the finest work, a pattern of mulberry leaves and ripened grain that she drew from Hester's notebook, and embroidered in threads she had dyed with walnut hull and goldenrod, green and gold, the colors of the river bottom in late summer. Abigail came twice a week to check the progress and bring bread, and once a small jar of honey that Elara ate in a single sitting with her fingers, because she could not bear to stop weaving long enough to find a spoon. The crisis came on a Tuesday night, 3 weeks before the harvest service, when the cloth was to be unveiled. Elara had fallen asleep at the loom, her head on the shuttle, when a sound jerked her awake, a shout, then the pounding of hooves, then the crack of wood splitting. She ran to the door of Martha's shop with her heart in her throat, and saw a shape disappearing down the road, too fast and too dark to identify. But she did not need to identify the rider. She needed to see the shed. Her shed. The Vance shed, a quarter-mile away across the field. She ran through the dark with her skirts hiked to her knees, her bare feet finding the frozen ruts of the road by blind instinct, and when she reached the shed, the door hung open, and the lamplight was guttering inside. She stepped through the threshold and saw it. 3 trays had been pulled from their frames and overturned. The worms spilled across the dirt floor, crushed and trampled where boots had ground them into the earth. The mounting frames for the next generation of cocoons had been kicked over, the cardboard cubbies scattered like fallen leaves. And on the wall, scrawled in what looked like ash, a single word: quit. Elara stood in the middle of the wreckage and felt the anger rise again. But this time, it did not settle into cold resolve. It broke into something raw, a sob that tore out of her before she could stop it. Because she was tired beyond tired, because the worms were dead, because the altar cloth was not finished, because the town was laughing, and Chester was winning, and Hester's notebook was the only thing left that had not been touched. And she was holding it to her chest like a child clutching a rag doll. She knelt in the dirt and began gathering the surviving worms, lifting them gently, one by one, into the empty trays, because the work was not done and could not be done by anyone else. She began to feed them again, by touch, in the dark, because the lamp had burned out and she could not spare the time to relight it. She fed them until her fingers were numb and the last worm had been found. And then she sat back on her heels and looked at the one word on the wall and understood that the only answer that would ever matter was the cloth itself. She would finish it. She would weave it through the broken nights and the stolen hours, and she would hang it in the church in front of every person who had ever laughed, and she would do it because Hester had carried a thimble of eggs across an ocean for the patient one, and the patient one was still standing. She worked through the rest of that night by touch and memory. The lamp too damaged to light, the shed too cold for the worms she had saved. She found the surviving worms by running her fingers across the trays, feeling the living ones move, lifting the dead ones out by feel, and setting them in a basket she would bury at dawn. The overturned trays had crushed perhaps a third of that batch, and the trampled ones beyond counting. But the mounting frames, though scattered, could be rebuilt. The cardboard cubbies she gathered into a pile and flattened with her hands, pressing out the boot prints. She did not look at the word on the wall again. She knew it was there, would always be there unless she scrubbed it away, but scrubbing would come after the feeding, and after the watering, and after the cloth. Everything came after the cloth now. Martha found her at first light, still on her knees, the basket of dead worms beside her, and her hands stained with the green of crushed leaves and the darker stain of something she did not want to name. Martha stood in the doorway, took in the overturned trays, the scattered cubbies, the word on the wall, and then she did something Elara had never seen her do before. She sat down on the dirt floor, pulled Elara against her shoulder, and held her while she finished the crying that had not quite ended in the night. They sat that way until the sun cleared the horizon, and the first light fell through the broken door and struck the word on the wall, making it seem almost to glow. Then Martha stood, brushed off her skirts, and said, "Right. We have work to do, and we do not have time for Chester Wainwright's cowardice to take up any more of it." They rebuilt the mounting frames that morning, using wood from a broken crate Martha had brought back from the general store. They salvaged the cardboard cubbies, cutting new ones from the pages of an old catalog Martha had been saving for kindling. They fed the surviving worms, counted them, and found that they had lost 43 of the best from that tray, the ones Elara had been saving for the altar cloth border. She would need to use a finer thread from the earlier cocoons, which meant slower reeling and more joins. The cloth would still be beautiful, but it would be different from what she had planned, and the difference would carry the memory of the night the town tried to break her. She decided that was fitting. The days that followed took on a rhythm that was almost mechanical, stripped of the wonder that had carried her through the first weeks. She worked because the worms needed feeding, because the reel needed turning, because the loom waited in Martha's back room, because the cloth would not weave itself. She stopped thinking about Chester's survey, about the blackened trees, about the word on the wall. She stopped thinking about the altar cloth as a statement or a triumph. It became simply the next thing her hands needed to make, the next yard of thread that needed to be beaten into the growing expanse of honey-colored silk. She measured her life not in hours but in inches of cloth. 6 inches a day, if she wove steadily. 8 if she skipped the midday rest. She skipped the midday rest most days. The frost came in the 3rd week of September, earlier than anyone in Meadow Creek could remember. It came on a still night when the sky cleared and the wind dropped, and the temperature fell like a stone dropped into deep water. Elara woke in the shed to the sound of her own breath frosting in the air, and she knew before she opened the door what she would find. The mulberry grove stood bleached and brittle, the leaves curled and brown along every branch. The last flush she had been coaxing from the trees was gone, killed in a single night by a cold that had no business arriving before October. She walked the row, touching each tree as she passed, feeling the leaves crumble under her fingers. The 40 trees, the 3 blackened ones, the rest now frost-killed, would not feed her worms another day. She had enough leaves stored in the root cellar to last perhaps 4 more days, enough to see the current batch through to their cocoons, but no more. The altar cloth border was barely begun, and the main body was still short by nearly a yard. She stood among the ruined trees and calculated, and the calculation came out to the same number every time. She had 4 days of leaves, and she needed 6 to finish the cloth. The gap was 2 days, and 2 days might as well have been a year. She went back to the shed and fed the worms what she had, measuring the leaves by the handful now, stretching each tray as far as it would go. She would not cull again. She would feed them as long as the leaves lasted, and when the leaves ran out, she would face what came. But the frost had not only touched her trees, it had touched every farm in the valley. The corn that had been left to dry in the fields stood blackened and ruined, the stalks collapsing under their own weight. The late beans were lost, the squash turned to mush, the hay that had not yet been brought in was worthless. The cattle would have to be fed on what little had been stored, and the stores would not last the winter. The frost had taken not a margin but a season, and the men who had laughed at Elara's glossy bushes and her shed full of worms began to understand that the things they had counted on had failed them in a single night, while the things she had built could not be touched by the cold. The first knock came on the 2nd day after the frost. A woman from the edge of town, her husband a tenant farmer who had lost his entire corn crop, stood at Elara's door with a basket of eggs and a question. She had heard about the silk, she said. She had seen the handkerchiefs. She knew it was not her place to ask, but the winter was going to be hard, and she wondered whether Elara might need help with the feeding or the reeling, in exchange for a yard of cloth, or a few coins, or whatever could be spared. Elara looked at the woman's hands, raw and chapped from work that would now go unpaid, and she understood that the frost had changed the town's arithmetic. The things that had seemed foolish when the corn was high now looked different against a landscape of blackened fields. She hired the woman on the spot, for 3 days a week, and set her to stripping the last leaves from the cellar stores. More came. A man whose wagon had sat idle since the hauler withdrew his services appeared at the gate, offering to haul anything Elara needed to the railhead for half his usual rate. His corn was ruined, he explained, and he needed the work. She accepted. The boy whose father had pulled him from the leaf-stripping job came back with his cap in his hands and offered to work for free, just to have something to do while the farm waited for the spring. She put him to work turning the reel. Within a week, she had 4 helpers, then 6, and the shed that had been a place of solitude became a place of quiet industry, full of the rustle of worms and the creak of the reel, and the low murmur of women and boys who had nowhere else to turn. Chester Wainwright felt the shift the way a man feels the first tremor of a floor giving way beneath him. The frost had taken his own fields as surely as it had taken everyone else's, but he had reserves. What he did not have was the town's ear. The men who had gathered at the feed store to laugh at the worm woman were now standing in line at her gate, asking for work, asking for cloth, asking for anything that might carry them through the winter. The editorial writer who had warned against unproven schemes wrote a new piece, unsigned as always, praising the resilience of local enterprise. Elara did not read it. She was at the loom. The border of the altar cloth took shape under her needle in the evenings, after the weaving was done and the helpers had gone home. She embroidered the mulberry leaves in green thread that matched the color of the living trees before the frost. She added the ripened grain in gold, sheaves that seemed to bend and sway as the cloth moved. In the lower right corner she stitched 2 initials, E and H, intertwined, her own and Hester's, the same way she had signed the handkerchiefs. The stitches were so small that a casual eye would miss them, but they were there, and they would remain there long after the cloth had worn thin. The night before the harvest service, she finished the last stitch by lamplight, alone in Martha's back room, the cloth spread across the cutting table in all its pale, glowing length. It measured 6 feet by 4, with a border of green and gold that caught the light and held it. She had used every cocoon from the frost-shortened season, every yard of thread she had reeled, every hour of sleep she had sacrificed. The cloth was not perfect. There was a place near the center where the weave tightened slightly, a visible line she could not beat out, and one of the gold threads in the border had snapped and been knotted in a way that showed if you knew where to look. She looked, and she saw the flaws, and she decided that the cloth was more beautiful for them, because the flaws were the map of what it had cost. She folded the cloth carefully, the way Hester had taught her in the notebook. Silk should never be creased, only rolled. And she carried it home through the dark, the roll cradled in her arms like something alive. The worms in the shed were spinning their last cocoons. The batch from the stores nearly finished. The trays would be empty by the end of the week. She had no idea how she would feed the next generation, no idea whether the mulberry would leaf out again in the spring, no idea whether the orders from St. Louis would arrive, or whether the town's newfound respect would hold beyond the winter. But for tonight, she had the cloth, and the cloth was ready, and tomorrow the whole of Meadow Creek would file past it in the church where they had spent every Sunday of their lives. She lay down on the crate in the shed, the rolled cloth beside her, and listened to the worms one last time before sleep took her. The sound had become the most familiar thing in her life, the rustling that meant something was alive and growing and depending on her. She fell asleep with her hand resting on the cloth, and the worms rustled on into the dark, patient and hungry and full of the next day's possibility. The morning of the harvest service arrived cold and clear, the frost still white on the grass when Elara rose from the crate. She had slept more soundly than she had in months, a deep, dreamless sleep that left her feeling hollow and light, as if the work had finally emptied her out and left room for something else. She washed her face at the pump, the water so cold it made her teeth ache, and she changed into the only dress she owned that did not have patches, a gray calico that had been her mother's, kept for occasions she had never imagined would come. The cloth lay rolled in its muslin wrapping on the crate, waiting. She lifted it and felt the weight of it, the density of all those threads, and she carried it out into the morning light. The walk to town took 40 minutes. She had not thought to ask for a ride, and none had been offered, though as she passed the first houses, she saw faces at windows, curtains twitching. The news of the altar cloth had spread. The frost had spread faster. The two things together had made the harvest service into something more than a church gathering. It had become the first time in weeks that the whole town would meet in one place, and everyone knew what would be unveiled, and everyone had an opinion. Elara kept her eyes on the road ahead, the muslin roll cradled in her arms like a child, and she did not look back. Martha met her at the church door, already dressed in her best black, her hair pinned tight. She took one look at Elara and said, "You look like you haven't eaten in a week." Elara could not remember when she had last eaten a full meal. Martha pressed a biscuit into her hand and steered her through the side door to the vestry, where the altar cloth would be hung before the service. Abigail Fairchild was already there, directing 2 men who had brought a ladder. They had built a frame of polished oak to display the cloth, a simple wooden bar with brass hooks, and they had hung it with muslin draped over top to hide it from view until the moment of unveiling. Elara handed the roll to Abigail, who unwrapped it with the reverence of a woman handling something sacred. The pale honey silk caught the vestry light and filled the small room with a glow that seemed to come from within the fabric itself. Abigail touched the border of mulberry leaves and grain, and she did not speak for a long moment. Then she looked at Elara with eyes that were wet, and she said, "It is more than we asked for. It is more than we imagined." She hung it on the frame with her own hands, adjusting the drape until it fell perfectly straight, then covered it with the muslin. The church filled in the hour before the service. Elara sat in the back pew, where she had always sat, where no one could see her face unless they turned around. Martha sat beside her, and the helpers from the shed filed in, the tenant farmer's wife and the boy, and the man with the wagon, finding seats near the front as if they belonged there. The pews were fuller than Elara had ever seen them for a regular service, the overflow standing along the walls. The frost had brought them, and hunger for good news, and the rumor that had passed from mouth to mouth all week. The worm woman had made something worth seeing. Chester Wainwright arrived late, as he always did, and took his usual seat in the third row, near the center, where everyone could see him. He wore his best vest and his stiffest collar, and he nodded to the men on either side of him with the easy confidence of a man who had never doubted his place in the order of things. But Elara saw him glance toward the vestry door, where the covered altar cloth waited, and she saw his jaw tighten once before he looked away. He knew. He knew what was coming, and he could not stop it, and the knowledge sat on him like a yoke he was not used to wearing. The service proceeded as it always did. The hymns, the prayers, the reading from the book of Ruth about the woman who gleaned in the fields and found favor where she least expected it. The minister, a quiet man named Reverend Cole, who had never once laughed at Elara, but had never defended her either, preached on the text from the Gospel of Luke about the mustard seed, the smallest of all seeds that grows into a tree where the birds of the air can find shelter. He spoke of faith that begins in absurdity and ends in abundance, and Elara felt Martha's hand find hers in the darkness of the pew. She held on. When the sermon ended, Reverend Cole paused. The church grew still, the way a room grows still when something important is about to happen. He looked toward the vestry door, then back at the congregation. "Before we close this harvest service," he said, "the women of the church have prepared a gift for this sanctuary, a cloth for the Lord's table, made by hands in this very community. I have not seen it myself. I have only heard of it, and I have waited, as you have waited, to see what patience and skill can produce when they are joined together." He nodded at Abigail Fairchild, who rose from her pew and walked to the vestry, her steps measured and unhurried. She pulled the muslin away in one smooth motion, and the silk caught the morning light that streamed through the east window and filled the church with a glow that stopped every breath in the room. The cloth hung from the oak frame like a sheet of liquid honey, the border of green and gold leaves and grain catching the light and throwing it back in soft waves. The congregation made a sound that was not quite a gasp and not quite a sigh, a collective intake of breath that seemed to pull the very air out of the room. Elara watched them. She watched the doctor's wife, who had bought 3 handkerchiefs, press her hand to her mouth. She watched the banker's daughter lean forward in her pew, her eyes wide. She watched the men who had gathered at the feed store, the ones who had laughed loudest, fall silent and still. And she watched Chester Wainwright, who had not moved since the cloth was uncovered, staring at it with an expression she could not read, his hands resting on his knees as if he had forgotten what to do with them. The silence stretched for 10 full seconds. Then a woman in the front row began to cry, not loudly, but with the kind of quiet tears that require no explanation, and the woman beside her took her hand, and the peace that settled over the congregation was the peace of something finally understood. Elara sat in the back pew, her hands folded in her lap, and she felt the tears coming too, and she did not try to stop them. She had not known, until that moment, what it would feel like to have the town see what she had made and not laugh. It felt like the first warm day after a long winter. It felt like coming home to a house that had never been a home before. The service ended with a prayer of thanksgiving, and the congregation rose slowly, reluctant to leave the presence of the cloth. People lingered, gathered in small groups, speaking in low voices, their eyes returning again and again to the altar. The children who had once run past the Vance shed with mocking shouts now stood silent before the cloth, their parents holding their hands. Elara remained in the back pew, watching, not ready to step into the current of the crowd. Martha stayed beside her, and they sat together as the church slowly emptied. The footsteps that stopped in front of her pew were heavy and deliberate. She looked up. Chester Wainwright stood there, his hat in his hands, his vest straining over his chest. His face was a study in warring impulses. the pride that had carried him through decades of easy victories, warring with something he was not accustomed to feeling. He stood there for so long that Elara thought he might turn and walk away. But he did not. "Miss Cross," he said, and his voice was hoarse, as if the words had to be pulled from somewhere deep. "I have been wrong about you." The admission hung in the air between them, raw and uncomfortable and true. Elara looked at him, at the man who had burned her trees and spread his whispers, and offered to buy her land for a pittance, and she found that the anger she had carried for so long had softened into something else, something closer to pity. He was a man who had built his life on being right about what other people could not do, and he had just watched a woman do the thing he had said could not be done. "Yes," she said quietly, "you have been." He nodded, a single sharp motion, and then he walked away, his steps heavy on the wooden floor, and Elara watched him go. She did not feel triumph. She felt something quieter and steadier, the satisfaction of work completed, the peace of a debt settled. She rose from the pew and walked to the altar, and she stood before the cloth, her hands at her sides, the light falling through the east window and striking the silk as if the sun itself had chosen this moment to bless the work. She touched the corner where the initials were stitched, E and H, and she thought of Hester Parrish carrying a thimble of eggs across an ocean, and she understood that the patient one had finally arrived. The church emptied slowly, the congregation spilling out into the cold September sunlight. But Elara remained in the back pew, watching the cloth catch the light. Martha had gone to speak with Abigail, and for a few minutes she was alone with the silk and the stillness. The afternoon light shifted, and the border of mulberry leaves seemed to move with it, as if the fabric were alive. She sat until the last of the visitors had filed out, until the only sound was the creak of the old building settling around her. Then she rose, walked to the altar, and touched the corner where the initials were stitched. She did not pray. She simply stood there, letting the moment settle into her bones, the way the frost had settled into the ground, deep and permanent. She walked home alone, the road empty, the fields on either side blackened and silent. The frost had taken everything it could reach, but the mulberry trees still stood, their branches bare now, waiting for spring. She did not know whether they would leaf out again. The notebook said they were hardy, that a single hard freeze would not kill them if the roots were deep enough. She had watered them faithfully through the autumn, and she had spread ash and manure around the bases the way Hester had written. She would have to wait and see. Waiting and seeing was what she had learned to do. The shed was quiet when she arrived. The last of the worms had spun their cocoons, and the trays stood empty, the frames clean. The next generation of eggs stored in a paper envelope in the root cellar, waiting for the warmth of spring. She had no leaves to feed them yet, no certainty that the trees would recover, but she had the eggs, and the eggs were the promise. She lit the lamp, sat down on the crate, and opened Hester's notebook to the first page. For the patient one. She read it again, and she understood that patience did not mean waiting passively. It meant continuing to work in the dark, trusting that the light would return. The knock came at dusk. She opened the door to find Chester Wainwright standing on her step, his hat in his hands, his collar loosened. Behind him, a wagon stood in the lane, loaded with something covered by a canvas tarp. He looked older than he had that morning, the lines in his face deeper, the certainty that had carried him for so long nowhere in sight. "Miss Cross," he said, and his voice was rough. "I have come to make amends. I do not expect you to accept them, but I am obliged to offer." He gestured to the wagon. "I had my men cut 20 mulberry saplings from the bottomland along the river, where the frost did not reach. They are good stock, strong root systems. They will be ready to plant by spring. I thought you might need them." She looked at the wagon, at the dark shapes under the canvas, and she did not speak. The offer was not restitution for the burned trees, not an apology for the survey or the editorial or the whispered warnings. But it was something, and from Chester Wainwright, something was more than she had ever expected. He continued, his words coming slower now, as if each one cost him. "I have been wrong. Wrong about what could be done with that ground. Wrong about who could do it. Wrong about you. I saw a woman alone, and I thought she would be easy to move. I was not prepared for what you were building." He looked at the shed behind her, at the lamplight spilling out of the open door. "I have never seen a thing built the way you built it. Alone, without help, without welcome. I could not have done it." I would have quit the first week. Elara stood in the doorway, the cold air curling around her ankles, and she felt the weight of his words settle into the same place where the anger had lived. The anger was still there, but it had shrunk, making room for something else. She stepped aside and said, "Bring the saplings. I will show you where to put them." He looked at her for a moment, his eyes searching her face for the mockery he deserved, and when he did not find it, he nodded and turned to the wagon. They planted the saplings together in the dark, by lantern light, along the same row where the burned trees stood. Chester dug the holes himself, his fine boots sinking into the cold soil, his vest unhooked and hanging loose. He did not complain. He worked in silence, and when the last sapling was in the ground, he stood back and looked at the row. They were small, barely waist-high, but they were alive, and they would grow. "I will have the survey rescinded," he said. "The property line stands as it was. You have my word." She believed him. She did not know why she believed him, but she did. Perhaps because a man who plants trees in the dark with a woman he tried to ruin is not the same man who wrote the editorial. Perhaps because the frost changes everything. The winter that followed was the hardest Meadow Creek had seen in 20 years. The snow came early and stayed late, and the river froze solid from bank to bank. The livestock that had survived the frost were kept close, fed on hay that had to be hauled from farther away, the roads impassable for weeks at a time. The town huddled around stoves and fireplaces, and the stories that passed from house to house were the stories of who had lost what and who had managed to hold on. One of those stories was about the worm woman, the one who had hung silk in the church, whose mulberry saplings were buried under snow, whose shed stood dark and silent through the long months. Some said she had given up. Others said she was waiting. Both were partly true. She was waiting, but she had not given up. She spent the winter reading Hester's notebook cover to cover, memorizing the diagrams, practicing the stitches on scraps of old cloth. She repaired her tools, oiled the reel, cleaned the loom that Martha had let her move into the shed. She slept in the house now, but she spent her days in the shed, keeping the cold out with a small stove, preparing for the moment when the snow would melt and the mulberry would leaf out and the eggs would hatch into the next generation. When the thaw came, in late March, she walked out to the grove and found the saplings standing where they had been planted, their branches beginning to swell with buds. The frost had not killed them. The snow had protected them. She knelt and touched the bark, and she felt the same small, fierce pride she had felt when the first handkerchiefs had sold. The worms came on schedule, hatching in the warm root cellar, 1,000 tiny specks of life that grew day by day into the familiar pale shapes. She fed them on the first tender leaves from the new saplings, and they ate with the same ravenous hunger as their predecessors. And the shed filled again with the sound of rustling. By the time the altar cloth was a year old, the silk from Meadow Creek was being sold in St. Louis under the name of Parrish and Cross, a small label that Martha had sewn into every bolt. The orders came faster than Elara could fill them, and she hired the tenant farmer's wife full-time, and the boy, and 2 more women from the congregation. The second shed went up in the summer, built by the same men who had once laughed at the worm farm, paid with the same money that was flowing out of the Vance place and into the hands of families who had lost their crops to the frost. Chester Wainwright took to tipping his hat when he passed her on the road, and the town that had once mocked her now sent their daughters to her to learn the reeling, because they had seen what patience could produce. On the first Sunday of the new year, Elara walked to the church alone, before the service, the morning light still low and golden. The altar cloth hung in its place, the silk glowing with the familiar honey hue, the border still bright. She stood before it and remembered the night she had found the overturned trays, the words scrawled on the wall, the tears she had shed in the dark. She remembered the hunger and the cold and the loneliness. She remembered Hester's hand on her wrist, the whisper in the dying room. Folks judge a thing by how it looks the first day. They never wait for what it becomes. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a single cocoon, the last one from that first batch, kept all this time in the paper envelope. It was small, golden, perfect. She set it on the corner of the altar cloth, where the morning light struck it, and it glowed like a tiny lantern. She did not know who would find it, or whether anyone would understand what it meant, but it was hers to leave, and she left it. Then she turned and walked out of the church, into the cold, into the work that was waiting for her, into the long life of a woman who had learned to wait for what a thing becomes. This is Elias Vance, and you have been listening to Frontier Secrets. Subscribe and step back in time. The frontier hides more than it shows.